Good evening. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on April 15th, 2024. This evening, I'm pleased to be joined by Mohammad Marandi. He's an American-born Iranian academic and political analyst. He's the son of Alireza Marandi, a physician who served in Iran's government as Minister of Health, as well as a member of parliament. After being born and raised in the United States, Mohammad returned to Iran and volunteered to fight in the Iran-Iraq War. He survived 2 chemical weapons attacks, was also wounded twice. He was then the head of the North American Studies program at the University of Tehran and is currently a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the university. He's appeared as a political and social commentator on international news networks such as Sky News, CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. And he was also a media advisor to the Iranian nuclear negotiations team in Vienna. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Mohammed.
Thank you very much for having me.
The first thing I'd like to ask you is something that I think many people outside of Iran are probably wondering at the moment, and that is, this is obviously a period of considerable danger for peoples of West Asia and, of course, for the people of Iran. What is your sense of the mood in the country at this moment?
Well, it is a huge country, so I can't speak for everyone, but I think that it's pretty obvious that overwhelmingly the Iranians approve of Iran's response to the Israeli aggression in Syria and the attack on the Iranian embassy, which led to the martyrdom, the murder of a number of Iranian officers, including 2 senior officers. I think in general, the Iranians are witnessing the hypocrisy of the United States, Britain, and France in particular, when they refuse to condemn the Israeli regime at the UN Security Council, and in effect, they supported the Israeli regime strike on the embassy as a result in the eyes of Iranians. And let alone the refusal to punish the Israeli regime. So the Iranians have obviously a lot to say about the United States and the West and what they've done to Iran over the past few decades, whether it was the coup in 1953, the support of the Shah and his secret police and his brutality and the crushing of and murder of many thousands of protesters during the revolution, U.S. support for Saddam Hussein, the fact that the West gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, and the political cover to use them and the military intelligence to better use them. And of course, U.S. sanctions against Iran, and Western sanctions, which have been going on for 4 decades, targeting ordinary Iranians. The Iranians recognize that, and they see this hypocrisy and support for the airstrike on the embassy as a part of that hypocrisy. But I think right now the Iranians are particularly angry at the West, and this comes as the West supports an ongoing genocide in Gaza. So it's fair to say that the Iranians are not happy with the West, and that they think that the response was necessary to prevent the Israeli regime from carrying out further strikes on other Iranian embassies in other countries and other Iranian facilities and murdering other Iranian citizens.
And just for the benefit of our viewers, and not enough people know about this, Mohammed, in the West, of course, but when you refer to the coup in the 1950s, I take it you're referring to the U.S. and British-backed coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, whose singular offense was that he wanted to nationalize, as I understand it, the Anglo-American oil company for the benefit of the Iranian people. Is that fair? Is that what you were referring to?
Well, back then, the Americans didn't own any part of the oil company. The Iranians wanted to nationalize the oil company, which was controlled by the British. But then the British and the Americans carried out the coup together. And after that, the United States dominated Iranian politics until the revolution, and the British gradually became the U.S. sidekick. But the coup undermined the Iranian national government, and as a result, the United States were in control of the country for a very long period of time. They plundered the country. They created the Savak, the notorious secret police of the Shah. They trained the Savak, and they supported the regime, the Shah's regime, when they were gunning down people in the streets of Tehran and other streets in other cities, and especially on Black Friday, when in Tehran a very large number of people were murdered. The next day, the U.S. president, Jimmy Carter, gave his support for the Shah. So the Iranians have many dark memories of U.S. interference in Iranian internal affairs.
Now, switching to the current time, yesterday, the New York Times reported that the Biden administration is, shall we say, encouraging the Israeli regime not to retaliate to Iran's missile and drone attack on Sunday. And according to the New York Times, unnamed administration officials say that Biden has told Netanyahu that Israel's response to the attack was some sort of fabulous success, and that therefore, and these were the key words, retaliation might not be necessary. What do you make of these claims? And specifically, do you think that the Biden administration is actually trying to deter the Israeli regime from further attacks against Iran? Or do you think this is essentially posturing by Biden for voters in the US who do not want to see the country drawn into a war with Iran?
I don't think the United States wants an escalation, because they know that the Israeli regime would lose and the United States would lose. If Biden and the political establishment in the United States thought that the Israelis could win in a confrontation with Iran or in an escalation with Iran, they would approve of it, because the United States has always shown itself to be brutal towards Iran and other independent countries. But they know that that's not going to happen. And therefore, they don't want this to continue. The US knows that Iran's drone and missile capabilities and other military capabilities are second to none in this part of the world. And this response that Iran gave to the Israelis was a complete success. The West would like to portray it as being otherwise, but if we go over it very quickly, it becomes clear. The Iranians announced that they're going to attack. They played mind games with the Israelis for about 10 days. Then the Iranians fired drones. It took them 3 hours to get to Israel. They made it very clear that the drones were fired. So they wanted the Israelis and the Americans and their other allies in genocide to strike the drones. Why? Because the drones were very cheap. Each drone cost roughly $10,000 for Iran. These are old Iranian drones, not the new drones. So there's no new technology there for the Americans and to discover or gain information about. And then the Americans and the Israelis and others, they fired all their most advanced missiles at these drones. And then the Iranians sent a number of old missiles that they had in stock from years past, again, like the drones, as decoys. And again, the Americans and the Israelis and the French and the British and this collective group of regimes, they fired everything they had at these missiles too. So the Iranians perhaps spent, I don't know, $10 million or so, maybe a bit more, a bit less, on these drones and missiles, and this coalition of genocidal states, they spent at least $1.3 billion.
Right.
And
that's the figure, by the way, as I understand it, being quoted by the Israeli media. The figure I saw coming out of there is 1.35 billion.
That's right. And that's not including other costs. So it was very inexpensive for Iran and very expensive for its adversaries. The West and Israel gained no intelligence about Iranian technology, because none of Iran's top-notch missiles and top-notch technology were used, or drones as well. But the Israelis and the Americans, gave the Iranians a huge amount of information about their capabilities, and
Right.
they depleted their stocks. And there aren't many surface-to-air missiles because so many are being used in Ukraine as well. And then Iran fired a number of missiles, something between 10 and 20. I don't know the exact number. These were more advanced missiles, but they were still not the best Iranian missiles. But they were better than the others, and they went right through these U.S., Israeli, French, British defenses and struck the two targets, one an air base in the south and one an intelligence gathering base in the north, both very heavily protected, yet they went right through. So for Iran, it was a huge win.
Mhm.
And the air base in the south was used to strike the Iranian embassy, but more importantly, it's used for the genocide in Gaza. And the intelligence base in the north is used for the Israelis to gather information about Syria and Lebanon. And, the West can say all it wants about the results of the operation, but the reality is that it was a big win for Iran, and the Iranians outsmarted the Western military and intelligence agencies.
And just for some context for our listeners, 1.35 billion, the figure quoted by the Israeli media, constitutes about 6% of the annual military budget of Israel in 2022. So that was expended apparently in the space of a few hours on Sunday. Now I'd like to turn to
on dirt cheap drones.
Correct. This is the decisive victory that has it's been characterized by the Biden administration and the Israeli military. Now, moving to the diplomatic sphere, there was a very interesting speech given.
So I just want to reiterate that not only was this very costly, and not only did Iran gather a great deal of information, but these drones were decoys. And they were also used so that the other missiles that were targeting the two bases, the 10 to 20 missiles, could get through Israeli defenses. And apparently every single one of them did.
Right. So moving to the diplomatic sphere, I'd like to play for you a clip of the speech given by the Iranian representative at the UN Security Council. I believe it was yesterday, following the attacks, my understanding is Israel asked for this emergency meeting. And I'd like you to listen, and then I have a question for you after I play this clip.
Madam President, as a responsible member of the United Nations, the Islamic Republic of Iran is committed to the purpose and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, reaffirms once more its commitment to the maintenance of international peace and security. The Islamic Republic of Iran reiterates its consistent position that it does not seek escalation or war in the region, while warning about any further military provocation by the Israeli regime. The Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms its unwavering determination to defend its people, national security and interest, sovereignty and territorial integrity against any threat or act of aggression, and to respond to any such threat or aggression vigorously and in accordance with international law. The Islamic Republic of Iran will not hesitate to exercise this right when required.
So I want to focus on a word which the Iranian representative used repeatedly, any. He said any further provocation, any further aggression. He said it quite a few times. In the West, the discussion around how Israel might respond has assumed that the choice confronting Israel is binary. And the choice is either do nothing, as the Biden administration purportedly is urging it to do, or to attack Iran directly, the sovereign territory of Iran, this time not a diplomatic mission, but the actual physical territory of Iran. But it seems to me that there are a number of options in the middle. And these are the options that Israel has tended to pursue in the prior years. For example, killing Iranian military personnel in Syria or Iraq, or perhaps trying to orchestrate a terrorist attack on Iranian soil without taking credit for it and leaving some sort of ambiguity as to who is ultimately responsible for it. When I heard these words from the representative of Iran at the United Nations Security Council, it occurred to me that perhaps the government is sending a clear signal that the game has changed, and that the Israeli regime should no longer anticipate any restraint from the government of Iran if it resorts to those types of attacks that I've just identified, the ones that it has tended to engage in. Is that how you read the situation, not just the commentary by the Iranian representative, but looking overall at what you're hearing coming from the Iranian government? Can we now say that this is a new normal and that Israel should anticipate, or at least believe that there's a serious risk that it will be attacked directly by the Iranian military if there's any form of provocation or aggression, either outside or on the territory of Iran?
Yes, I think it's very clear that the Iranians have changed the equation. Until now, until the strike on the aggressive act against the against Iranian sovereignty and the strike on the Iranian embassy, the Iranians have shown patience, strategic patience, when the Israeli regime would bomb and murder Iranian officers in Syria, both during the war against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates, which were supported by the Israeli regime. ISIS and Al-Qaeda had bases alongside the Golan Heights, and the Israelis supported them. They gave them ammunition. They treat their injured. And whenever the Syrians or the Iranians or their allies would advance on ISIS and Al-Qaeda positions, the Israelis would carry out airstrikes, artillery strikes, and the tanks would also fire upon the opponents of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So back then, the Iranians did not respond because they didn't want to expand the conflict. They wanted to focus on defeating these terror groups that were supported by NATO and their regional allies. Then, more recently, and especially during the last 6 months, the Israelis murdered a number of officers, Iranian officers in Syria. But the Iranians again showed patience, strategic patience, because they wanted the focus to remain on the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So after this attack, the Iranians, as I pointed out, carried out this very successful response. But I think more importantly, what the Iranians have done is they've stated that from now on, we will not tolerate any attack on Iranians or Iranian assets anywhere. And I think that if the Israelis want to carry out a strike on Iranian targets outside of Iran, they're going to face a harsh response from Iran. And if they try to strike Iran, as they're claiming they will, then they will also receive a massive retaliation, much greater than what they experienced the other night. The Iranians will carry out an operation probably 10 times as large in within hours. So the Israelis will definitely be on the losing end of any exchange, but the Israeli regime is not a sane regime. They're not reasonable. Even in their evilness, they're not very smart and sane. So there is there's a big possibility that they will miscalculate and they will face the consequences.
They've often cited, particularly Netanyahu, I mean, it's fair to say he's had an obsession with the Iranian nuclear program. Notwithstanding the fact that in the early 2000s, it was reported in the West that the CIA had come to the conclusion that Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And then, of course, following the conclusion of the Obama-era nuclear deal with Iran, when Trump announced that he was about to withdraw the United States from the deal, the International Atomic Energy Association confirmed that Iran was complying with the deal, and nonetheless, Trump withdrew the U.S. from the deal. Now, however, and I've seen reports, I'm certainly no expert in this particular area, nuclear weapons development, but I've seen reports that Iran is close to having the capacity, that doesn't mean the intention, but the capacity to develop a nuclear weapon. In the current circumstances, what is the Iranian government's position with respect to the development of an indigenous nuclear weapons capability, particularly considering that Israel has dozens, if not hundreds of nukes, and is the only state in West Asia that isn't a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
The Iranians have a very advanced nuclear program. It's much more advanced than the Israeli program, but it's a peaceful program. And if we look at Japan, Japan is also a threshold state, but it doesn't have nuclear weapons. So the same is true with Iran. Iran has no plans to produce nuclear weapons. Of course, when the Israelis constantly threaten other people like the Gazans or Iranians with nuclear attacks, that has an impact on public opinion about what Iran should do in response. But the administration, the government, the state has no intention whatsoever to produce nuclear weapons. If Iran wanted nuclear weapons, it would have had them many years ago. I think there was a study that said, I think the Wall Street Journal wrote something about this, I'm not sure, but that if an individual, a non-state actor, a billionaire, wanted to build a nuclear weapon, that he could do it with, I think, $1 billion and within 5 years, something like that. I may be wrong about the numbers, but the point is, for Iran, they've had this capability for well over a decade, maybe even 2 decades, but they've never pursued nuclear weapons because Iran doesn't feel the need to have nuclear weapons. And the reason why the United States is fearful of Iran is because of Iran's conventional weapons capabilities. If the United States chose to attack Iran, then the US would be expelled from Iraq. Iraqis would expel the US. They would be expelled from Syria because their illegal occupation in Syria is dependent on Iraq, and US bases in the Persian Gulf would be destroyed, and all those countries that host US personnel or bases will be seen as hostile for obvious reasons, and their assets will be destroyed, and that will lead to a collapse in the global economy, because without oil from the Persian Gulf or gas from the Persian Gulf or from the Caucasus, then the situation would be catastrophic across Europe and North America. So there is a sort of balance of terror. The Americans know that war with Iran is not possible. They cannot win. They'll lose. It would be a catastrophe for the world, but it would be particularly catastrophic for the United States. And therefore, I think that leaders, or at least many people in the United States, are still sane enough to recognize that this is not something that they could do and get away with.
Nonetheless, and particularly because Iran doesn't have a nuclear arsenal, the Israelis do. And you've indicated, I think, completely fairly that they've tended to engage in extreme violence, reckless behavior. There are multiple indications that Israel is hurtling towards a strategic defeat, a multifaceted one: military, economic, political. Surely the Iranian government, because it lacks a nuclear deterrent, it must be quite cognizant of the reality that Israel is capable, at least theoretically, of using them. And this must in some way impact the way it manages the risks around its conflict with Israel. How do you think this is going to affect the decision-making and conduct of the Iranian government going forward as Israel hurdles towards this strategic defeat and the risk of it engaging in ever more desperate acts escalates?
In Iran, the feeling is that the Israeli regime cannot use nuclear weapons because it would lead to the immediate destruction of the regime. The international community will not accept it. Russia won't accept it. China won't accept it. No one will accept it. Maybe the United States and Europeans would, or the regimes in North America and Europe would like to find this as acceptable, because we've seen that they are brutal and immoral in Gaza and elsewhere. And as the Israelis have already threatened, senior officials to starve. Well, they said they will starve Gazans, and the West has helped them with that by cutting aid to UN agencies. But when the Israelis also threatened, Israeli officials threatened to use nuclear weapons in Gaza, the West was silent. But I think that the United States recognizes that if the Israeli regime uses nuclear weapons, or seriously contemplates using nuclear weapons, that would be a bridge too far. And the United States and Europe would see their own downfall in international terms. They would be completely isolated, and across the world, Israel would be treated very differently than now. But again, Iran does not want to produce nuclear weapons, and Iran has no intention of doing so. But this sort of rhetoric does change public opinion in Iran. So it's smart for the United States and the Europeans to tell their mad dogs in Tel Aviv to stop barking.
And in terms of the extremity of Israel's behavior, despite the fact that the Israeli regime has slaughtered in excess of 14,000 Palestinian children in approximately 6 months, it's constantly alleging, as are its Western backers, that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism, and that the groups that Iran is allied with, which it refers to as proxies, principally Hezbollah, Hamas, and Ansar Allah in Yemen, that these are terrorist organizations. Perhaps some people in the West are becoming increasingly skeptical of these claims, but how would you respond to these standard allegations that are hurled against the government of Iran and its allies in the region?
Well, it's interesting that all the major terror attacks happen in countries that are considered as adversaries by the US and its Western allies. We've seen a number of terror attacks in Iran. Just a few days ago, 5 police officers were murdered. A few weeks ago, 19 suicide bombers attacked Iran and killed, I think, 15 police officers, and all of them were killed as well. And then before that, we had the murder of 11 other police officers near the border, all of these near the border with Pakistan, because these Western-backed terrorists come from the Pakistani border. And then a few months ago, there was the bomb explosions, again near the Pakistani border, which killed roughly 100 people. So all the terror attacks are happening in Iran or in Russia, or Chinese citizens in Pakistan, as we saw a few weeks ago, or in Syria. But we don't see anything happening in Europe and North America. And I think it's obvious. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and these extremist Salafist Takfiri groups, they are allied to the West. And they've been cooperating with the West for many years. In Afghanistan in the 1980s, in Libya, in Syria. The dirty war in Syria was, it was clear that the Americans and the Europeans and sadly the Turkish government and the Israelis and Jordan, they were all facilitating the influx of tens of thousands of foreign fighters into the country. And these extremists destroyed a great part of Syria. And we know that the United States wanted to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. We know that because of the U.S. intelligence agency document of 2012, where it said that U.S. regional allies wanted to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. And later on, the head of that agency, General Michael Flynn, said in an interview on Al Jazeera, of all places, that the U.S. took a willful decision to support that policy. So that Salafist entity was, of course, ISIS. So the U.S. was supporting Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and all these other terror groups. So who is the state sponsor of terrorism here? On the other hand, Iran supported Hezbollah. Who is Hezbollah? When Israel invaded Lebanon and took the capital, Hezbollah was born as a resistance organization. It was a national resistance organization that expelled the Israeli regime from Lebanon in the year 2000. Why does Iran support Hamas and Islamic Jihad? Because they are Palestinians whose land has been taken and who've been ethnically cleansed and who are treated as subhumans alongside the whole of the Palestinian people by this ethno-supremacist regime in Palestine. Iran did the same for South Africa when the West considered Nelson Mandela and the ANC and others to be terror groups and terrorists. The Iranians supported the ANC and the political wing. And when the apartheid regime collapsed, one of the first countries that Nelson Mandela visited was Iran. So it's not that, Ansarullah, despite the genocidal war that the U.S. supported, the Saudi and Emirati genocidal war, where they spent hundreds of billions of dollars to destroy Yemen, and the Americans helped enforce a starvation siege against the country. Despite that, Ansarullah has been in control of 80%. They're in control of the capital, and 80% of the population lives in areas controlled by Ansarullah. Why is that the case? Despite U.S. and Saudi and Emirati efforts and German and the collective genocide, because the people of Yemen support Ansarullah. So these are legitimate resistance organizations that have popular support among their own people who've been oppressed by the West and their proxies. And whereas on the other side, the United States has a history of supporting terror groups that carry out mass killings. And even 9/11, regardless of what people think about what happened on 9/11 or what led to 9/11, if you accept the official narrative of Washington, Al-Qaeda was an organization that cooperated with the United States in Afghanistan. The US and Saudi Arabia and the British were funding it. So the United States cannot argue about terrorism. It cannot say anything about genocide. It cannot say anything about human rights, because the greatest violator of human rights on this planet is the United States.
And lastly, you've been very generous with your time, Mohammed. I'm going to unkindly ask you as gratitude to pull out your crystal ball and offer your opinion, to the extent you're willing to share it with us, as to what you think ultimately the Israeli regime is going to do in response to this attack. What's your best guess as to how it is going to respond?
I can't say, but I think that when the Israelis say that they're going to carry out an attack, if they don't, they're humiliated. So I think they will probably do something. But if they do, the Iranian response will be disproportionate, and it will be nothing like what the Israelis saw just a couple of days ago. It will be something much greater. And the Iranians, as I said, through this operation, they've gathered their intelligence, they've depleted Israeli and US reserves. The United States cannot defeat Iran's missile defense capabilities. They lost in the Red Sea to Ansarullah, to Yemen, and their capabilities are minute compared to that of Iran. And meanwhile, and at the same time, the United States is fighting a losing battle in Ukraine. So the Israelis would be making a stupid move if they attack Iran, but we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, and I hope we can continue our conversation in the future.
Thank you for having me.
This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on April 15th, 2024.